$81.5 million borrowed. 13 men, one last bet to save a dying American legend. In 1903, two brothers built their first engine in a shed barely bigger than a closet. 80 years later, the company they founded was hemorrhaging market share to Japanese imports, and the 13 executives who just bought it back drove to Washington to beg the government for a tariff wall. Their market share had collapsed from 70% to under 25% in less than a decade. They weren't lobbyists. They were engineers and operators who had staked their savings, their careers, and their entire company on one conviction: that American manufacturing could still compete. The story begins in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the 1880s. The Davidson family had come from Aberdeen, Scotland. William C.C. Davidson had brought his wife and children across the Atlantic and settled in Milwaukee, where the city's foundries, machine shops, and rail yards made it one of the great industrial centers of the American Midwest. He worked with his hands. He expected his sons to do the same. Arthur Davidson was born in 1881. His brother Walter was 5 years older. A third brother, William, was born in 1870. The boys grew up in a city that smelled of iron and coal, surrounded by men who made things for a living and were proud of it. Arthur showed an early talent for mechanics and a gift for talking to people. Walter was quieter and more deliberate. He had trained as a machinist at the Northwestern Railway shops and developed there the patience and precision that would define him for the rest of his life. The man who would complete the founding partnership was not a Davidson at all. William Harley was born in 1880, 1 year before Arthur. They had grown up on the same block. They had fished together as boys. As young men, both had found their way into the city's machine trades, and both had noticed the same thing developing in Germany and France. Small gasoline engines were being fitted to bicycle frames. The machines were crude and unreliable. They were also the future. Harley began sketching an engine design in 1901. The concept was simple: a single-cylinder gasoline engine fitted into a reinforced bicycle frame. Harley and Arthur Davidson began building it in the Davidson family basement. They were not engineers in any formal sense. Harley had studied through correspondence courses. Arthur had the mechanical vocabulary of a bicycle repairman. Together they were building something they knew would be incomplete before they ever tested it. The first engine ran. It would not climb a hill. The carburetor was wrong, and neither man had enough knowledge of fuel-air mixture ratios to fix it on the first attempt. Help came from a machinist friend with experience in precision casting, who contributed to the redesign of the intake system. His name was Ole Evinrude. He would later become famous for inventing the outboard motor. By 1902, the revised engine was producing enough power to justify building an actual vehicle around it. They moved from the basement to a shed in the family's backyard at 38th Street. The first version of that shed measured 10 feet by 15 feet. That is not a figure of speech. It was smaller than a modern shipping container. Arthur's father helped build it. Someone painted the words Harley-Davidson Motor Company on the door. That is the first time those words appeared anywhere in the world. In 1903, the first complete motorcycle left that shed. It had a single-cylinder engine with a displacement of roughly 25 cubic inches. The frame was built around a reinforced bicycle architecture. The whole machine weighed approximately 200 pounds. It was, by any honest assessment, not yet exceptional. The engine was underpowered. The belt drive stretched under load. The rider had to pedal to assist on steep inclines. Arthur Davidson sold it to a friend. That man rode it and then sold it to someone else. That second owner rode it for more than 100,000 miles before finally retiring the machine. It had been designed to prove something. It had. By 1904, Walter Davidson had left his position at the railway shops and joined the company full-time. They produced approximately 3 motorcycles in 1903. Growth was not yet explosive. The machines were still being refined. The second-generation engine incorporated improvements to the valve timing and lubrication. The gap in reliability between the Harley-Davidson and its American competitors began to close. In 1906, the company moved into a dedicated factory on Chestnut Street, which would later be renamed Juneau Avenue. That address would become one of the most famous manufacturing addresses in the history of American industry. What happened in 1908 transformed the company's reputation in a single afternoon. Walter Davidson entered the Federation of American Motorcyclists Endurance Run, the most demanding motorcycle reliability competition in the United States. He scored 1,000 points, a perfect score. No competitor had achieved it before. The Federation examiner reportedly stated that he had not believed such a result was possible. The press covered it. Dealers called within days. Arthur Davidson understood immediately what had happened and moved to capitalize on it. He had a salesman's instinct and an unusual ability to build lasting relationships. He began traveling constantly, signing up dealers in cities the company had never reached. By 1910, there were Harley-Davidson dealers in every major American city. By 1913, the network had grown to 150 dealerships. In 1909, the company introduced an engine configuration that would define the brand for the next 100 years: the V-twin. The concept was not original to Harley-Davidson, but their version had a character that competitors could not immediately replicate. The 45-degree angle between the two cylinders produced an uneven firing interval, which generated a distinctive rhythmic pulse that the exhaust amplified into something closer to thunder than a mechanical sound. That sound was not designed. It was an accident of engineering geometry. It became an identity. Production volume accelerated. The workforce grew from fewer than 20 people in 1906 to more than 1,500 by 1916. When the United States entered the First World War, Harley-Davidson delivered approximately 20,000 motorcycles to the United States military. The machines were sent to France and Belgium, where Army dispatch riders and reconnaissance units depended on them in mud, cold, and sustained mechanical stress that their civilian counterparts never faced. Corporal Roy Holtz became the first American soldier to enter Germany after the armistice. He was riding a Harley-Davidson. By 1920, the company claimed to be the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world, with authorized dealers in 67 countries. The 10 by 15-foot shed on 38th Street had produced something neither Arthur nor Walter Davidson could have imagined when they were sketching carburetor modifications in a borrowed basement. Then the Depression arrived. In 1929, Harley-Davidson had sold approximately 21,000 motorcycles. By 1933, that number had fallen to 3,703. Read that again. 3,703 units. In a factory built to produce tens of thousands of machines annually, 3,703 was near silence. Workers were released in waves. The payroll shrank from more than 2,000 people to fewer than 700. The Davidson brothers responded by introducing a smaller, lighter, cheaper engine configuration. It was not enough to restore the volume of the 1920s, but it was enough to keep the company alive when Indian could not hold on. Indian Motorcycle entered bankruptcy during the Depression. Harley-Davidson did not. That single fact defines the difference between the two companies. Between 1941 and 1945, Harley-Davidson produced approximately 90,000 WLA motorcycles for the United States military and its allies. The WLA was fitted with an oil bath air cleaner, an auxiliary ammunition box, a leather scabbard for a Thompson submachine gun, and blackout lighting. American soldiers rode them across North Africa, through Italy, and across France. Soviet forces used them on the Eastern Front, shipped under Lend-Lease. When those men came home and the GI Bill put money in their pockets, many of them went looking for the machine they had learned to trust. The post-war years brought a cultural shift the Davidson brothers had not anticipated. On July 4, 1947, the town of Hollister, California, held its annual motorcycle rally. Approximately 4,000 riders attended. The event became disorderly. Life magazine published a photograph of a heavy-set man sitting on a Harley-Davidson surrounded by beer bottles, grinning at the camera. The caption described an invasion of outlaw motorcycle gangs. Later accounts suggested the photograph had been staged. The number of arrests was 29 in a crowd of several thousand, but the image was already printed. The story was already told. Hollywood made a film called The Wild One in 1953, with Marlon Brando playing a fictional outlaw motorcycle gang leader. When asked what he was rebelling against, Brando's character answered, "What ya got?" The outlaw motorcycle clubs that formed in the late 1940s and 1950s chose Harley-Davidson motorcycles specifically because the brand had been associated with power, noise, and a deliberate refusal to be quiet or polite. The marketing department at Juneau Avenue had not created this association. It had been created in the streets, in the press, and in the movie theaters. The three founding brothers died within a decade of the war's end. William Davidson died in 1937. Walter Davidson died in 1942. Arthur Davidson was struck and killed by a car in 1950. William Harley had died in 1943. The company they had founded from nothing was now in the hands of the second generation of family management. Indian made its final closure in 1953. Harley-Davidson had the American market entirely to itself. That monopoly lasted 16 years. In 1969, the board of directors accepted a buyout offer from AMF, American Machine and Foundry, a New York conglomerate that manufactured bowling equipment, nuclear reactors, and leisure boats. The acquisition price was approximately $21 million. AMF moved immediately to increase production volume. New manufacturing operations were established at a facility in York, Pennsylvania. Production targets were set aggressively. The workforce at both facilities struggled to meet them. Quality control deteriorated. Motorcycles left the factory with oil leaks, electrical failures, and assembly defects that the pre-AMF machines had not exhibited. Dealers began receiving complaints within months. The machinists in Milwaukee developed a phrase that spread through the network of Harley riders across the country: "Buy a Harley, get a Honda to tow it." The Japanese manufacturers who had entered the American market in the mid-1960s were, by the late 1970s, a category of competition that Harley-Davidson had never previously encountered. Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki were not competing on price alone. They were competing on engineering quality, on production precision, and on reliability metrics that American manufacturers were not measuring with the same rigor. AMF's response was to increase marketing spending and maintain volume. It was not sufficient. By 1981, senior Harley-Davidson executives had concluded that the company could not survive another 5 years under AMF's ownership. 13 executives, led by Vaughn Beals, organized a leveraged buyout. They raised $81.5 million. They had no assurance that the investment would be recovered. They signed the papers in June 1981 and took ownership of a company that was losing money, losing market share, and losing the trust of its own dealer network. The next 4 years were the hardest in the company's history since the Depression. In 1982, Harley-Davidson's share of the domestic heavyweight market fell below 30%. By early 1985, the company was approximately 1 week from filing for bankruptcy. The banks had been contacted. The legal paperwork had been prepared. Willie G. Davidson, the grandson of William Davidson and the company's chief designer, drove to his bank personally to request an extension on a credit line. The decision required approximately 30 minutes. The extension was granted. 1 week later, new financing was secured. Harley-Davidson did not disappear. In 1983, the 13 executives had driven to Washington. Their petition to the Reagan administration was direct. Impose emergency tariffs on imported heavyweight motorcycles. Give us 5 years to fix what is broken. We will not ask for more. Reagan signed the order in April 1983. The 45% duty on imported heavyweight motorcycles gave the company a price advantage in its core market for 5 years. The executives who had petitioned for the tariff understood what it was: protection, not competitiveness. They committed, in testimony before the International Trade Commission, to using the time to fix the underlying manufacturing problems rather than shelter permanently behind a trade barrier. They delivered on that commitment. The production management methods that Toyota had developed and refined in Japan were implemented at Juneau Avenue and at York. Inventory management was rebuilt from the ground up. Quality control checkpoints were redesigned with factory floor workers involved directly in the process. Defect rates fell. Then they fell again. By 1986, the motorcycles leaving the factory were measurably better than anything produced during the AMF years. In 1987, with 1 year remaining on the Reagan tariff, Harley-Davidson appeared before the International Trade Commission and asked to have it removed early. The company did not need it anymore. The coverage of that announcement reached every major newspaper in the country. The detail that stayed in every story was this: the American manufacturer that had asked for government protection was now telling the government it could compete without it. The 1990s brought a transformation that none of the 13 men had fully anticipated. Harley-Davidson stopped being primarily a machine and became primarily an identity. The Harley Owners Group, founded in 1983 with a few thousand members, had grown to over 300,000 by the early 1990s and would eventually reach more than 1 million. Licensing revenue from clothing, accessories, and branded merchandise grew to represent a significant fraction of total company income. The customer base expanded far beyond the traditional demographic. Executives, doctors, and lawyers bought Harley-Davidsons because they wanted access to the same mythology that the original Outlaw riders had built without asking anyone's permission. The stock had gone public in 1986. By the early 1990s, it was one of the most closely watched growth stories in American manufacturing. The machines are still running. The factory on Juneau Avenue is still in operation. The V-twin engine configuration that William Harley sketched on a sheet of paper in a Milwaukee bicycle factory around 1901 is still in production. The 45-degree angle between the cylinders, the uneven firing interval, the sound that became an identity before anyone understood what an identity was in commercial terms, that geometry is unchanged. Arthur Davidson started with a borrowed basement and a brother who could hold tolerances to 1/1000th of an inch. He had no university degree. His formal education had ended in adolescence. What he had was an instinct for what people wanted, a talent for building relationships that lasted, and a friend who could sketch an engine into existence on a piece of paper. Walter Davidson had a machinist's precision and a financial conservatism that looked like stubbornness until the moment it saved the company. Together, they built something that armed 2 armies. They survived the worst economic collapse in American history. They outlasted every competitor that had ever entered their market. They created a mythology so powerful that it survived their deaths, survived a corporate acquisition, survived near bankruptcy, and is still operating today. The company was almost destroyed by men who understood the value of the brand, but not the cost of losing it. It was saved in the end, not by a government program or a corporate restructuring strategy, but by 13 executives who had learned to build motorcycles and refused to let anyone stop them. And somewhere in that lineage is the direct inheritance of what Arthur and Walter Davidson did in 1903 in a shed that was 10 feet wide and 15 feet long, when they decided that precision and quality were not negotiable, even when the market was telling them that anything cheaper would do.